You've got a job. Okay. All right. So diving in, how many of you have already started your business? Okay. Good. I would say the majority. Just if you're comfortable, I'll ask questions. If you're comfortable sharing, go ahead and just blurt it out. What entity type did you pick, maybe, and why, when you decided what entity type to go to? Entity type means like LLC, corporation, PLLC.
Sole proprietor, right?
What's that?
Sole proprietor?
Sole proprietor. Yep, absolutely. Anybody want to share?
LLC, because if the worst happens to my business, I don't want it to come back on my family.
Gotcha. Okay. LLC. Yeah. Probably the most common business entity type. I would say, at least in Utah. I went to law school. Bulk of my law school experience was back east. I would say back there, a lot of people, even smaller companies, do corporations. Just a regional thing. When you talk about protecting your family, your business, or protecting your family, your personal assets from anything that might happen, as you're operating a business, the same protections are in place for corporations as LLCs. So, you don't get more protection necessarily by electing to do or choosing to do a corporation versus doing an LLC. There's strong protections in place for LLCs, just like corporations. Anything different?
So I think it'd be a good time to ask, how many of you started a business and haven't done anything? And then sole proprietorship seems to be the easiest one, so a lot just do that. But how many of you, by a show of hands, haven't set any kind of corporation up? You're just running your business. Anyone?
Gotcha. Okay. So by default, you are a sole proprietor. So at this point, anything you do moving forward will actually there'll be a benefit. Either in the way of some protection for your personal assets. Anything you do moving forward there's just benefits to be gained at that point. Now, I bump into sole proprietors on a regular basis. Just did some estate planning for an individual last week who has ran a company in our community for probably 30 years and is a sole proprietor. So nothing wrong with being a sole proprietor. There are fewer or no, not necessarily any protections, but your protections are very limited as a sole proprietor versus if you actually created an LLC or a corporation. Anybody else? Oh, we had a sole proprietor over here. You guys, awesome. And again, nothing wrong with that. Sometimes, based on the nature of your business and what you're doing, it probably absolutely makes sense to be a sole proprietor. So, nothing wrong with that. So we've kind of touched on those. I didn't do a trial run on this prior. I don't want to get stuck too long in any one area. But just know, and again, we're trying to keep things general so it can apply to anybody. Just know LLCs, sole proprietors, corporations, LLCs, like I said that one. Those are your basic kind of main business structures. There's pros and cons to each, especially when you get into kind of the taxation part of stuff, which I won't wade out into that today. That would be maybe a good follow-up to have an accountant come in and follow up on the taxation and what tax election you decide to go with. But anyway, first step, basically, decide what your entity type is. I'd say the majority here, and definitely, I'd say the majority in Utah, you do the LLC. Doesn't have the meeting requirements, the directors and not shareholders, but directors and officers. You don't have to have a bunch of people involved in your organization to create that structure, right? An individual can be an LLC, or you can have multiple individuals that come together as members to be an LLC. So LLCs are very flexible. And kind of as I stated, it offers you that basically the same protection you would get if you were a corporation. Let's kind of move down the LLC path. Does anybody get a feel like they got gypped if I talk heavy on LLCs versus other entity types? No? Everybody good with that? Okay. Sole proprietors, if you were to change your business or select a business structure or entity type, my guess is if the sole proprietor thing has basically worked for you and you just wanted to take advantage of a few of the benefits of having an entity type in place, I'm guessing you would kind of shift over into an LLC anyway. So probably one of the most important components to an LLC, if there's more than one member, member equates to owner when you're talking LLCs, is an operating agreement. Operating agreement is kind of like the bylaws of a corporation. They basically spell out who's in charge of what, who has authority to bind a company, based on their role as maybe in the financial aspect of the business, maybe hiring and firing, maybe acquiring additional equipment the business might need. And so the operating agreement is a document that kind of spells that out. A lot of times, let me back up a second. If you're a sole member, so if there's one of you, or your husband and wife, oftentimes people don't set up an operating agreement. If you're a sole member of an LLC, you're basically in charge of everything anyway. But if your LLC is comprised of 2 or 3 or 4 members, the operating agreement becomes very important, especially at the onset when you're starting your business, right? There's lots of optimism. Oh, this is going to be great. We're going to start this. It's going to be awesome. But as you move on, right, starts looking more and more like work. Sometimes, not all the time, sometimes it takes longer than you thought to get, your business built up to where it's running at the optimal level or, the level that you hoped when you started. And it's pretty common, once, 4 individuals start something like that, they realize, ooh, this is more of a time commitment than I wanted. I'm getting out. I'm bouncing. If that happens to you, the operating agreement would be very important because it also specifies who owns what percentage of the company. That's where it breaks down. Well, there's 3 of us, we each own 33.3% of the company, or some other configuration. I don't want to belabor the operating agreement. Probably that's probably deep enough into the operating agreement. Just in general, keep in mind if you have multiple members or you plan on growing and adding members down the road, the operating agreement is going to be a really important document.
What about changing that? Is it just?
That's a great question.
Just.
Yep, operating agreements are amendable. So if at the onset you guys say, well, there's 3 individuals that are starting this business, we're all 33.3% owners. I'm taking care of the legal part of the business, you're taking care of operations, and Alan, you're gonna take care of equipment, because I know that's your specialty. And then halfway through, I'm like, okay, guys, this is way more work than I thought. I'm getting out of here. You guys would just amend that operating agreement to reflect now 2 owners, each 50 or 60/40 or whatever that new configuration looks like. That would just be amended at that point. So, great question. Any other questions at this point? Awesome. The next thing I want to talk about, very briefly, licensure. Depending on what your business does or what field your business is in, you have to be licensed, possibly. As an attorney, I had to be licensed. You have to be licensed before you can. Before I started, my business of being an attorney. That was a pain in the butt. I also have a contractor's license. Still kind of a pain in the butt, but not quite as much. If you have a licensure requirement, you'll want to check with the state of Utah Department of Professional Licensing. That's the government department, entity, whatever, who's in charge of your licensing if it applies. Anybody here required to have a license with your business? Just by show of hands. You did. Anybody else? Okay. What do you mind sharing what yours is?
Trying to start scrap metal recycling business here.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay. And state requires a license.
There's like 16 pages of.
Yeah, fun. CPA. Yep. The obvious ones are like all the professions: dentists, doctors, therapists, attorneys. Most construction trades require some type of licensure. They've changed the licensure requirements for contractors over the last 10 years. There's been quite a few changes. They've tried to simplify it, tried to make it easier. I don't know if they've actually achieved that, but I think they have. From when I started, to the requirements now, I think they've made it a little bit easier, especially if you're working in a trade that's not HVAC, plumbing, electrical. If you're doing carpentry, concrete, roofing, stuff like that, it is relatively easier now. We had a couple there. Any questions specific to licensure? Sounds like you already.
I'll probably come crying to you later.
Okay. We can commiserate.
So in terms of like a quick service restaurant or something, the equivalent would maybe be a permit, and then the inspection from the health department, that would be considered licensure on that end, maybe?
Yeah, I can. Last time I looked at the list of businesses or occupations that require a license, I don't remember restaurants or food industry. Don't quote me on that though, because it's been quite a while. But yeah, other things that you have to do, right? Permits.
Yeah.
Health department, that'll be your headache, for sure. And then of course, whatever city you're operating in, you have to have a business license with the city. Yeah. I'm trying to be aware of what time. I want to get through most of this stuff, but at the same time, I don't want to skip over something that is very applicable or that you guys will help you guys. So let me hit on one more thing about. Oh, yes, sir.
So you mentioned the license with the city. What kind of things, or what would be an exemption from having to have that? Because like 90% of my business is traveling out of town to in-person events or selling online. So.
I don't think I've ever had a client who wasn't kind of operating, so to speak, in town. If you pop into the city office, they can tell you if you have to have a business license.
We still have to have a business license even though we travel to different counties.
Yeah.
Just because our main home base is here, you know.
Yep. That's
We file taxes in this community, we,
yeah.
do all the things here in Juab County, so we still have to have a Juab County business license.
Yeah. So I would, there could be exceptions, there are probably very few, and I would say the best way to know if you meet an exception would be to go in there and talk to them. Because they can tell you for sure. Good question.
I would say though, they have some leeway. You don't have to necessarily have a license on day one, like a lot of businesses don't work out. But if it's gaining traction, then it's a good idea to get a business license. But you don't usually have to get one in every city that you do a job.
Correct.
like a contractor, they may be licensed in Nephi and they build in Heber City. Heber City wouldn't require them to have a business license.
Yeah, or your business is, you know, kind of originates from, you know, where you pay your taxes, stuff like that, that's kind of, now, that's not the same in every state, but in Utah, that's, in Ohio, if you're operating in different cities, there's some cities that require a business license if you're gonna operate in their city, so, anyway, we won't go there. But that's for Utah. Yeah, you don't have to get a business license in every city that you operate, but most likely you'd have to get one for wherever kind of home base is. Any other questions? All good questions tonight. Okay. I guess the last thing I want to talk about under kind of our formation, inception portion. When you go to set up your LLC, you have to decide if you're going to be a manager managed LLC or a member managed LLC. So again, if you're an individual, there's one member, it's just you, probably nothing you need to worry about. If you have multiple members of your LLC, you'll have to decide, okay, who is the manager? And essentially, that's the person who signs all the documents. That's like the agent for the business. It's the CEO, basically. If you're the corporation, you sign all the documents, you know, do all the applications, stuff like that. In Utah, the default, if you don't select something different, is you're a member managed. And so, if you don't select otherwise, and there's multiple members, then you're all just co-managers, which, you know, down the road, if there are issues, can become a problem. So, on the front end, if there's multiple members, owners of your LLC, the operating agreement is where you will specify, okay, at the end of the day, who's in charge? Who's the manager? And that would be an important kind of component to make sure you have taken care
Is
of.
that something that can be changed?
Absolutely, yep. Just like anything, and that's contained within the operating agreement. And that can be amended just like, you know, owner and anything else. Yep.
If you're the member managed, then any member can sign any of the documents.
Essentially,
If you're
yes.
The manager managed only.
Mhm. Then the manager is the one that,
Manager can-
for example, if you want to take out a small business loan, normally the first time you'll have somebody ask you that is if you go to borrow money. Just typically, just in general. You know, you started your business, things look like they're gonna take off, you're like, okay, well, let's borrow some money and buy a piece of equipment. When you go to the bank to acquire that loan, they'll say, okay, what's the breakdown of your business, who owns what percentage, and who's the manager, because that's the person who's gonna sign, otherwise everybody has to sign. And like I said, you know, hope it never happens to anybody in this room, but when things go south, that can kind of create issues if it's not specified, spelled out in the operating agreement, and it's clear who the manager is. So, I've seen businesses whereas they're fracturing and people are not happy and they're going and doing this, that, and the other, you know, all kinds of stuff just hits the fan. And so, particularly if there's more than one member, more than one owner in your LLC, it's really critical you have that spelled out. So. Any other questions? We're gonna jump over into kind of the next phase, you know, legal things, legal considerations as you're operating your business. So before we move to that, any other questions about formations, getting started? Anything else that way?
So I guess like lease agreements, or a contract in that regard, is that part of formation? Would you consider that, or?
No, I would say that probably falls under the next category.
Okay.
In fact, that's one of the things that I had on here. So
Okay.
maybe we'll start with that. Let's see if there's another. Yeah. let's just jump into that, because that kind of segues very well with the manager versus member managed LLC topic we were just on. So, you know, you started your company, you have, you know, the three individuals who are going to be operating the business, that are owners that are involved. You know, if we haven't specified who the manager is, essentially anyone can go and start making contracts, right? Make a contract with, you know, somebody for a piece of equipment. Make a contract with a bigger company for, you know, services that you're gonna provide. Now, if you're going to a bank to get a loan, they're gonna be very careful that they have all the owners of the company, anybody who has an interest in the company, they're gonna make sure they have their signature on a paper before they lend money. Or that you produce an operating agreement that says you're the manager, you can sign and bind the company. If you're doing a contract for services you're gonna provide, the individual you're providing the services to probably isn't going to verify if there are more members of the LLC that need to sign that contract. We're not gonna go down that rabbit hole, because that's a long, deep one. But you can imagine if you have 3 or 4 individuals, nobody knows who really is signing, has authority to sign to bind a company, and everybody's just going out, signing contracts for, you know, services you're gonna provide. So, you know, we can spend, we can have a lot of fun stories, about that. But, I don't think we'll waste time, going down those. Just know, again, it goes back to that operating agreement, who has authority, who's in charge, who's the manager, that person has to sign. If not, well, the bank's probably gonna check, but anybody else probably isn't gonna verify.
How official does an operating agreement need to be? Like, you wrote ours,
Yep.
but like, if you're just a smaller business, like, print it out on a piece of paper, have everyone sign it and have it? Or does it need to be like a lawyer writes it for you?
That's a good question. There are components to an operating agreement, that if you're going to, let me say this, if you're going to have one, it's probably worth having a good one. So I would say, unless you're fairly comfortable with the language of an operating agreement, or you find a generic form online and you understand the language very well, it's one of those things where if you're gonna have one, you ought to have a good one. Now that doesn't mean that you couldn't do your own, but they can either prevent or cause lots of headaches. And so, from my perspective, having a good document that's gonna prevent headaches is probably in your best interest.
So I was helping a friend that had gotten divorced, but neither of them used an attorney. And then later they decided to go to war and amend it. And the judge is like, I hate these that weren't done by an attorney, because now there's all the, and then if that person gets an attorney and you don't, and neither of you had one when you wrote it, you're gonna aid alive. And so there's some of these documents where I think it's better to if you create yourself, then hire an attorney to look at it. Because man, it can save you, if no attorney involved, and all of a sudden someone else gets an attorney and tries to sue you, you know, chances are you're gonna be a sitting duck.
Yeah, it can really cause some problems. The reality is, unless you have a very complicated structure and several owners, an operating agreement is not really that costly. You're probably, I would say that average cost of an operating agreement that I put together for people who have an LLC, you're probably on the lower end if you're like a single member. I don't want to sound like a salesman. Do I sound like a salesman? Just informational.
Yeah.
You're probably, you know, $200, maybe $300, up to like $400 or $500, maybe $600 if you have several members and you have, you know, there's lots going on. You really want to make clean lines on who's responsible for what and who can do what. Yeah, so it's not a huge cost. And I know up front, when you're trying to get started, you know, that can pinch a little bit. But I would almost say you're better off not having one than having a bad one. Which kind of brings up an interesting question, what if you don't have one? There's default language in the Utah code that would basically govern what would then happen. It works. Certainly isn't custom tailored to your business, but there's enough there that it will provide a judge a framework to say, okay, well, did they do this? No, they didn't have a manager. Okay, then a member's the manager. There is a default there written in the state law, but it certainly isn't going to be tailored to your business. General rule, probably better to have a good one. It's probably one of the things I would say is worth spending a few $100 on. So, any other questions on that? The operating agreement or contracts, that's kind of what we were segueing into. Did I kind of answer the question or where you were?
Yeah, so is there can either party, can me as a person who's going to lease or the person who has can either one of us come up with the agreement, or is it more customary for the person who owns the property to do it and we just,
Yeah.
the language is good, or
So specific to you, kind of in the food, if you're leasing space from a landlord, I would say 99.9% of the time, they're the ones that come up with the lease, right? It's their property, they want the lease to, have terms in there that are kind of specific to their property and how they want their property used while you're leasing it from them, things you can and can't do on the property. If any of you ever go to lease some property and the landlord says, well, why don't you come up with a lease and send it to me, give me a call, because I would like to, that would be I think that would be a first, for somebody to be leasing property and the landlord to say, hey, why don't you take over the lease? So I would say 99.9% of the time, that's, when it comes to leasing a building or a piece of equipment, that will come from the person who you're leasing from. And I think that applies if you're talking equipment, a building, kind of anything like that, any kind of lease or purchase contract. Maybe you're gonna buy the equipment, you're leasing the building from your landlord, but you're gonna buy some equipment. Most of that stuff would come from them. I'm trying to kind of touch and go on contracts a little bit because that's another rabbit hole that that we could go down that would take a lot of time to go over all possible scenarios. But I did have it on my list. Just a general warning, I think. Before you sign a contract, at least read through it and make sure that you know what it says. I can't tell you how many times I have people come in and not to buy not just to buy a potato mixer. Like, people make huge purchases without even understanding the terms of the contract. What the payment terms are, what the default terms are. If you don't make these payments, or if you do A, B, or C, then you end up in default. So as a general rule, read through those, make sure you know what they say. Especially the bigger the purchase, the more important that you understand.
So as far as contracts and say liability waivers, do you think that could you get an attorney for those types of things to go over to make sure on your end it's bulletproof, nobody can come after you, or do you feel the general ones that are out there are fairly decent?
Just in general, forms that you download from the internet or print off the internet, they have good provisions and they have good terms in them. The question is does it apply to you? And does it spell out the term or the provision that you want, or is it a landslide or a windfall for the other person? So
is that even something that an attorney would do, is put together,
yeah.
a liability waiver?
Yeah, liability waiver, yeah, I do liability waivers dozen a year probably. And it's kind of the same thing, right? Like, you wanna make sure that your liability waiver covers kind of specifically what you're doing. Because you can have a liability, you can download a liability waiver. Actually, funny story. Had a client come in, they had downloaded a liability waiver from the internet. Well, it was for the use of a pool. They were not operating a pool at all. And so they were having people sign a liability waiver for using their pool that they didn't even have. Now, the provisions in that form were great. I even stole a few out of those and put over into mine, because it was very well written, but the guy didn't have a pool. So if that goes to a judge, the judge is like, wait a minute, you have an agreement here saying that you're waiving liability for using the pool, but that's not actually what you're doing. So probably wouldn't help you out.
Yeah.
But that is a good, liability waivers, it's another topic we can talk about.
Yeah.
Okay, gosh, weird. I'm gonna rattle off some stuff that, I'm gonna try to go quickly through these. When you talk about, I want you guys to be familiar with a couple of terms, some language. When you're talking about protecting your home, your personal assets from your business, right? What you're talking about is the corporate veil. It applies if you're a corporation or an LLC, but generally speaking, it's called the corporate veil. What that is it's a protection for your personal assets from the operations of your business. I'm gonna go really quick here. Generally speaking, the way you achieve corporate veil protection, right, protect your personal assets from your business operations, is you keep them separate in every sense of the word. Banking transactions, make sure you have a bank account set up. I mean, kind of a gold standard practice, have a bank account set up at a separate bank than where you do your personal banking. Now I say that because that's the gold standard. I personally don't have separate bank accounts at separate banks for my personal. I do my personal and my business banking at the same bank. But to the degree you keep them separate, right, that strengthens that veil protection in the event that somebody tries to sue you for what's gone on with your company. You know, you have a piece of equipment, you know, one of your employees backs over somebody and kills them, they come after your insurance. If that doesn't cover it, they can, you know, they would come after you individually. Whole class, 4 months of law school, of just terrible things that happen and what people do to try to, you know, satisfy a judgment to make somebody whole for, you know, some terrible accident that happened. So, kind of the bottom line to corporate veil, know the terminology, understand what it is, right? It's what protects you from your business activities, and to the degree you keep your business and your personal stuff separate, that is what builds and strengthens that corporate veil.
So if someone sues you and sees that you're using the same checking account for your groceries and to pay the bills for the business, that makes that what you're saying, that makes you, they could tap into your personal belongings too.
No, not necessarily. So if somebody came into me and said, hey, I've got this individual who did this, and I was harmed by this, their company doesn't own anything, their company doesn't have any assets. I need to go after the owner's personal assets if I'm gonna be made whole from this accident that occurred. The first thing I would do is say, okay, well, let's you know, you start the lawsuit, right? And then as you're going in and you subpoena the bank records, if they send business and personal bank records from the same bank, I would go through those very carefully and see what transactions, you know, if I'm going through the business account and I see that they took the family to Disneyland, that doesn't really strengthen the corporate veil, right? You're kind of blending the line on what's personal and what's business. Now, if you've already done that, don't panic. Nearly, I shouldn't say that, lots of people do that. I've yet to find one specific act that just totally destroyed the corporate veil. Now, you know, I don't practice in this area on a daily basis, and so I'm not on the case law, I'm not 100% certain if there's been a case that said, well, because of this one act. It's normally, they look at everything that's gone on. I mean, if you're repeatedly, over and over, using your business account for personal purchases or transactions, right? It's gonna be easy for the judge to say, well, yeah, you guys didn't really separate these, you know. You were using your business account for all your personal, you know, transactions. If they go through all the banking transactions and they find one where you bought tickets to go to Disneyland, I mean, I can't tell you how a judge would come down on that, but generally speaking, from my experience, one transaction isn't going to, completely destroy your corporate veil.
So kind of along the lines with that, if you're putting your business into a trust, would that help secure, like say you put your personal assets and your business assets like all into a trust?
Yeah, you wouldn't want to do that because now you're bringing them all under control of the same entity, the trust.
Okay.
So that's actually counterproductive. I do quite a bit of estate planning in my practice, meaning like trusts, wills, stuff like that. So I'll just touch on that real quick because I did have that on my list. There's a way that you can provide for succession planning with your business, meaning you build this business during your life, you want to leave it to your kids. There's a way to transfer that to your family, to your kids, to whoever you want through a trust. But there's kind of a certain way to do that.
Right.
And you wouldn't just put, you wouldn't name the trust as the owner of the business. You'd want to keep those separate. Just on paper, regardless of how you handle your bank accounts, on paper that creates a separation. And that's what you're trying to do, to strengthen that corporate veil.
So another quick question on
Yeah.
that one. What about using, say I got a home equity line of credit and I wanna use some of that to help start the business, things go in there, and then eventually they're coming back.
Yeah.
That's still keeping things separate, or is that a bad deal?
I would, what you would want to do, there's a way to document that kind of transaction that makes it actually like a separate transaction. It's not just you feeding the business along until it kind of takes off on its own. Very common practice.
Wouldn't it fall more under like a member contribution to your company?
That's what you want to make it look like.
Okay.
You want to make it look like that you as an owner of the company are making a contribution to the company, which is what it is, right? But there's kind of a simple way to document that actually makes it look like that, and not just, well, you're covering payroll for the company, this month kind of thing. And so there's a way to do that and maintain that separation and that corporate veil protection. We could go deeper into that, but did that kind of answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. Very common practice.
I mean, I got lots more questions, but it's.
Yeah. Well, and we'll try to get to a Q&A, and I'm happy to stay a little bit, 5 minutes. Couple of things I just want to mention. Federal regulations, FMLA, FLSA. If you have employees, probably things you should be familiar with. Those are federal regulations enforced by the Department of Labor that say, yep. In fact, you should probably take over this section. You probably know the
Maybe next month.
the what?
We're doing accounting next month, I think. Business finance next month.
Awesome. Fair Labor Standards Act, Family Medical Leave Act, when your employees can leave and you have to hire them back, you know, maternity leave, you know, sick days, stuff like that. Fair Labor Standards Act, overtime pay, you know, minimum wage pay, child labor laws, lots of stuff that I'm not an expert at, but things to be aware of if you're gonna have employees. Also, while we're talking about employees, employer liability. I had a couple of years ago, I had a guy call me up and say, well, my employee, something to do with the trucking thing. He'd gone out of state, and I think he got into an accident or something out of state. Forgetting what it was. But he came in and he was upset because why he was so fired up. But essentially, he was going to be responsible for the actions of his employee, and he was very upset about that. And I said, "I'm sorry, you as an owner of a company or business owner, there is liability that you assume through your employees." This is another thing we could talk for hours on. But after that experience, I thought, just in general, it's good to know that, you know, before you go hire, you know, a bunch of 16-year-old kids and you send them out to, you know, run a piece of equipment, know that, you know, whatever happens, it's probably gonna come back on you. So, or if they're operating kitchen equipment, right? FLSA has a bunch of standards of what kids can do if they're working for you in a restaurant, what they can do based on their age, so on and so forth. We're doing on time.
Yeah, you're okay.
Okay. I might just touch very briefly on the last section, and then we'll do some Q&A. There's lots of stuff there to go into, but a lot of it, you know, is probably going to come up in very specific situations, and so, you know, to take time now to go through all those probably isn't the best. Jumping into the final, you know, part that I wanted to talk about, succession planning. How do you now take the business that you've built, that you know, it's kind of been your baby that you've created, and what to do with it when the time comes to retire? Couple of things that I have seen over the years, ways to transfer that on. At some point, if your kids or a partner, owner, has stepped in and is helping you with the business, you go back to the operating agreement and you add them as a member of that of the business through the operating agreement. You give them, right, you carve out a portion of the company and you give that to them. You know, maybe along the way you had an agreement with them that said, hey, if you come and work, you know, for 5 years, doing this, you know, at the end of the 5 years, you'll have acquired 10 or 15% of the company, or whatever that kind of transitional kind of agreement is. All things that work, that will allow you to, you know, pass your business on to somebody else, or sell it, right, the idea, or pass it on to your kids. All things that need to be probably in a contract. I had a client last year out in, I won't say where they're from, Central Utah. They ran a fertilizer company, and dad and son had been working at this for years. Of course, you know, pretty old school, didn't have an operating agreement, didn't have anything on paper, not even a napkin. and suddenly dad started suffering from dementia, you know, and brothers and sisters went in, petitioned the court to be the guardian of the dad, and basically just ousted brother, who had been working with dad for 20 years in this company, and because there was no documentation, he had no leg to stand on. It was a super sad deal. So however you decide, or whatever goals you have in passing your business, passing your, you know, your baby that you've worked for onto your kids or to the next owner, documentation is critical at that point. So whether you do it through a family trust, you talked about putting your business into a trust. Again, there's a way to do that where the business gets passed on to your kids through your trust. That happens without actually making the trust owner of it. You know, whether you do a buy-in period with the next owner or whoever's going to buy it from you. But again, really important that those kind of things have documentation that go along with them. Otherwise, if it's not documented, you know, and something happens, like somebody becomes incapacitated, or you know, somebody steps in to take care of them, you can kind of be out in the cold. So.
Does that have to be a written document, or could you make a video document?
That's a good question.
Video nowadays is really easy to do.
Sure. Yeah.
You know, you got both of you on there, hey, I agree to this, you agree to that.
Yeah. If that was all you had, that would be better than nothing for sure. I can't honestly say I have an idea of how a judge would rule on something like that. You know, there's always a question of, you know, undue influence. You know, well, yeah, you got this individual in front of the screen, but is there somebody, you know, behind the scenes there pulling strings or threatening or making promises, or, you know, hey, if you do this, then we'll, you know, whatever. So.
And of course, nowadays with AI, video testimony is going to be worth less all the time because the fakes are getting pretty hard to tell.
It's a very good point. Yeah. So, not certain on that, but you know, some written documentation that's signed by a notary that can verify, yeah, this individual came in and this is what he did. You know, is super helpful. So.
Yeah, because AI documents are hard to sell.
Yeah. Yep. So, let's see if there's any other topics of AI. Right? Whoever thought we'd do here.
We'll do a class on AI when we get to right now we're in Startup Academy, but when we get to just Entrepreneur Academy, we'll get into AI.
Yeah. That kind of covers lightly everything I had in succession planning and whatnot. I think at this point, it'd probably be more beneficial for you guys just to answer questions and to, you know, keep rambling on about you know, succession planning. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to fire away.
Well, since everybody's mind is on AI, right? Going back to where you were talking about contracts and stuff like that. So, like for me, I've been working with my AI tools, teaching them my business for the last 2 years. So they know it, they're kind of like a partner almost. Would it be safe to have them write some of those documents, like for me, NDAs?
Yeah.
Would it be safe to do that versus pulling them off the internet?
That's a good question. I've seen both. More familiar with just, you know, template forms that come off the internet. But I have seen an increasing number of AI-generated documents. I would say, based on my limited experience, and this is very limited, because I've seen a small handful of AI-generated legal documents, personally, that I've dealt with, they seem to be when you do the AI, right, you're feeding it information, right? So they seem at first blush that they're more custom tailored to your business, right? I at this point, I'm pretty safe saying that if you were running a business doing, if you were running a restaurant, and you did an AI generated contract, you wouldn't get a really good pool liability waiver. You know, you're gonna get something fairly specific to the restaurant, just based on what you're feeding into the AI, you know, generator. So I would say probably possibly, boy, that's a tough question. I'm gonna say this, but don't quote me on it. I would say what comes out of an AI generated document is probably more specific to what you're doing, but the provisions that it's writing are still only as good as what you're putting into it. Now, you know, they've come a long ways in generating kind of the legal appearance of the document. You know, the provisions kind of have that legal jargon feel to them. But at the end of the day, it's only as good as what you're putting in, or what you've trained how advanced the AI is in your area, I would say. So it's gonna be more specific to what you're doing than possibly something you just download off the internet. But you would want to be careful that the provisions that it spits out is actually what you told it to generate. Anybody else? Anybody an AI expert? It's a huge thing in the law right now. There are states, there are jurisdictions that are trying to ban its use. There are some states that require attorneys to basically certify that they haven't used AI to generate court-filed documents. So from a legal perspective, AI is it's in its infancy right now. From a legal perspective, there's really not a ton of, good solid case law on it. So it's causing a stir.
Again, have someone who knows what they're doing do it.
And again, if you're putting your stuff in there and you say, okay, hey, I need a contract, I'm gonna buy, 15 pallets of this stuff, whatever your business is, from, so-and-so. If you read through that and you're like, yeah, we have the right, we're talking about the same material, we're talking about the same time frame, we have an accurate payment schedule, you're probably off to a really good start. But without actually seeing what it generated, I can say, oh yeah, that's great. Yeah, it's a tricky thing. AI is a tricky thing, especially in the law right now. So, again, what I've seen, generally speaking, been relatively impressed with. But but again, it comes back to it's only as good as what you're putting in, or that it's adapted to.
So how would you go about, like, for example, our 11-year-old wants to start his own business, and he's funded the whole thing with his own money, but obviously he can't do like day-to-day operations, so how could we protect him and help him along the way? Like, obviously, like, we don't want anything out of the business, but we want his business to succeed.
You want to feed the entrepreneurial spirit, right? Yeah.
So like, would an operational agreement even be worth anything where he's, again, 11, he doesn't know what he wants out of his company?
Right. That's an interesting question. Never come across that. Just as we're sitting here, there are documents, particularly one that's very common in that goes kind of hand in hand with an operating agreement as a buy-sell agreement, which basically anticipates a time when when somebody's interest in somebody's ownership in the LLC or in the company is going to terminate, it's gonna go back to the other owners, or they're gonna sell it. And so you plan ahead, at the onset, you plan for when that buy-sell agreement takes effect. The reason why I mentioned that is because that would be enforced against you guys, so it'd be signed by you guys, wouldn't necessarily need to be signed by him, because it'd have capacity to contract, due to his age. There would be a way to do it for sure. Never looked into that, but I'm thinking something along those lines is probably how you would anticipate and prepare for something like that, where you're helping your child start something that ultimately you would turn over to them down the road. There's kind of a bunch of taxation issues that might come up with that. We'll table that for when the account is here. So.
I want to jump back to liability waivers. A lot of people have, you know, the home-based businesses, and you got customers coming to you, either your house or maybe you got a shop or office out back. What kind of liability, you know, with the LLC keeps you separate from, well, they're coming to my house and we're doing business, but
Right.
they slip and fall on the stairs and hurt themselves, who they sue.
Right. That's a good question.
And to top off on that, so obviously if you get on Google, you have to have an address, so
Mhm.
I hate that like our home address is our
Right.
business,
Yeah.
because we're mobile, we don't have customers come to our house at all, but where we're registered as a business with that, could they sue the business if they fell on our home
on your
property?
Yeah. Those are two good questions. So, obviously, the easier of the two, if you have a detached building or even your garage, you know, and your clients, or your customers, are going to that garage, never entering your home, you know, I've never come across that.
That's an easier way to keep them separate, I guess.
Yeah, I mean,
Even though it's on the same property.
you could imagine if you had a detached garage. I'll tell you what I'm gonna answer that question, is talk to your insurance agent. I'm totally gonna deflect that one. But it is a good question, and it's something that you would want to make sure one way or another you're covered, right?
Yeah.
So if I was in your situation and I had that same concern, I would call up my insurance guy and be like, hey, look, this is what I got going on. I wanna make sure I'm either covered through my business or through my homeowner's insurance policy. But I would wanna make sure I'm covered one way or another there.
Okay. Would that fall also under, say you're starting to, you wanna teach people out in woodworking or something, you have a woodworking shop and
Yeah.
people, you know, I mean, obviously you would want a liability for people who are using the wood burners, you don't wanna burn
Yeah.
themselves type of thing.
Yeah.
But it would still come under probably the insurance clause for,
Yeah, I mean, I would do a liability waiver for sure, on something like that. And in that liability waiver, I'd have them release you individually and also your company from liability. But at the end of the day, I would also just make sure that I'm insured somewhere. Because you can have a liability waiver, even a well-written one, and, you know, you go to see the judge on a bad day, I mean, he might say, well, you know, that liability waiver is flawed because of A, B, or C, and so, you know, I'm gonna deem that invalid based on the activity. You know, there's no way they can waive liability, really, and participate in that activity. So I would have one for sure, but I would check with your insurance guy and just say, hey, I have this liability waiver, I have an LLC set up for this, that's over this operation that I'm doing. but I just wanna make sure it'd be covered one way or the other.
Mike, can I add that this kind of stuff, you wanna know the answer to that, because when the guy falls and says, I'm gonna sue you, if you can come right back with, good luck, buddy, I've got this and this already in place, or whatever, then that's like, whoa, okay. But if you know, like, you need to know, or so you don't stress for 3 days, that happens on a Friday at 4:30, you can't get a hold of your attorney or insurance guy. All weekend you're sick over it.
Yep.
Like, you need to know part of, you work in your business, but you gotta work on it. And you gotta work on it enough to know these basic things.
Yep.
So that when something goes down, you know you're covered. You don't have to sit and wonder and stress and can't wait for Mike to call you back or whatever it is. There's just own up to being an owner and find this stuff out.
Are the liability waivers, like, do they hold up pretty well in court?
Yeah, again, I would say have them. You know, it depends on what your business is. Now, you know, you can't have your employees waive liability for working at your company, right? But like if you have people coming to your house, or if you, you know, if you're performing a service that requires, your customers or your clients to interact with your property, maybe you do aquatherapy, you have a pool in your backyard. I would for sure have a liability waiver on that. Even if that pool is somewhere else, right? I would still I'd have a liability waiver for that.
Well, I know, like, when we did a nonprofit, and we had everybody sign a waiver, the first thing was a smoke screen. If they wouldn't sign it, don't let them participate.
Right.
But also, it was like, yeah, we signed this waiver, but if I do something stupid and someone gets hurt, regardless of the waiver, they can come back on me, right?
Sure.
Like, the waiver covers
Negligence.
normal, the normal thing was fine, but if I stretch an extension cord across the stairway and somebody
Trip 'em as
trips
they're
down
coming
it,
up the
I'm gonna be
stairs.
liable whether they signed a waiver or not, right?
Right. That's a very good point. Liability waivers, are limited in what they're gonna cover, But generally speaking, most accidents that would occur, they would cover that, you know what I mean? Anything you would expect them to cover, they would cover that. I mean, if you, like I said, if you had a scenario where your employees or your kids, did some overt act, right, that caused them harm, it wasn't a pure accident, or, I forgot to, do A, B, or C, it's not gonna protect you, but most of those instances, you wouldn't really expect it to anyway, or you would, you'd be like, well, that was, call my insurance guy, so.
So would you want a different type of liability waiver, or maybe the same one, if like, I got a friend who does wood burning,
Uh-huh.
and if he would teach classes, like, does he need to have one that says, you're using my tools, these are hot, blah, blah, blah.
Yep. Yeah, I would, something like
You want
that.
something like that specified in
Yep.
the contract, of you're responsible for knowing how to use the tools
Yep.
properly.
Yep, we're using them in a manner as directed. Because again, if your friend took the hot torch and was over here, trying to get something up off the thing and, to reach out and burn somebody, that's a little bit different. Than him saying, okay, look, this is what you need to do, you need to, yeah, yep. So, good questions, all good questions.
What would something like that cost for you to put like just a waiver together for a basic?
A liability
business?
waiver, they're really not, it's a pretty simple document, it's a one-page document. Trying to remember the last one I did, was for a family member, so.
This is something different than going to the gym and signing.
Sure.
liability waiver.
Yep, exactly.
Weights drop on me and
Yep,
I'm dead.
Yeah.
Cause I'm stupid.
yep,
Yeah.
yep.
Yeah, we want one that will like protect our business, because we go to people's houses
Right,
and we're doing,
yep,
we're fixing their cars or whatever.
yep,
Um,
And you have
But-
those customers where you do an R&R on their engine and then magically their taillight lights don't work.
and that's your fault, you know,
Yeah.
for some stupid reason, and you don't even touch their wiring.
There's a special category of just headaches that are just part of being a business owner.
Yeah. But then we also have, you know, Gabriel, he bought bouncy houses, and so this summer he's starting a bounce house business.
Yeah,
And so that's actually our next step is we're looking into insurance, we're looking into the waiver of liabilities, we're
Yeah.
looking into those things, so
Yep.
the contracts.
yeah,
But
Yeah.
I want my 11-year-old to be protected from the idiot that decides they can do a double backflip, you
Yeah.
know, with a bouncy house.
yeah, yeah. Nope, good question. Yeah, I mean, again, you know, they're kind of probably lower end as far as costing go, you know, maybe $200 or less to put together a liability waiver that's specific to what you're doing. Yeah. Other questions?
Let's take time for one more question, then
Okay.
we'll, and maybe if you have a minute, some could ask you a question after.
Sure. Yep.
Okay. Any more questions?
So I got one, clear back to like the formation. At what point would you consider a hobby or a side hustle and actually turn it into a full-fledged business? Do the LLC, do all the licensure and all that kind of stuff?
That's a good question. Probably, it's probably a kind of a personal question. I don't know if there's a magic, you know, path or stepping stone that once you achieve that, you probably ought to, you know, turn it into a business.
I think that also deals with like taxes, right? Because
Yeah.
once you hit a certain amount that you're making, you have to pay taxes or you have to start doing sales tax and stuff. So I think
Anything
that's
you
a
want
big
to chime in on
tax
that
thing.
from the accounting side?
Yeah, in my opinion, I think she's on the right line. If you're starting to receive 1099s or any kind of official government document that's gonna force you into claiming that income, any income on your tax returns, probably gonna wanna start a business. Doesn't necessarily mean you need to do an LLC or do something formal, but you're gonna wanna start to be able to, you're gonna have to claim that income, so you're gonna wanna be able to offset it with your business expenses. And so that's kind of a profitability thing and something to help you save taxes.
So at what point do you have to start reporting your taxes? How much?
That's next time.
Next time?
I was gonna say, some of it's gonna be, how much liability do you wanna take on, you know? I mean, you have
Right, well, and
been
I'll just
helping
give
somebody
you,
out in the garden and doing gardening for a while, and now you want liability protection on.
Yeah.
I'll just give you a really quick, for example, and this is a very, very small level, but I have a brother-in-law that runs the Kenworth Sales store down in Price, Utah. His wife comes in and cleans the office once or twice a month. I don't know how often, but anyway, she gets a 1099 from them. Usually anywhere from $4,000 to $6,000 a year. Not a lot of money, right? Well, we form a business for her because that's a pretty big hit on their taxes. And so that way she can offset her mileage, any supplies that she buys, her cell phone that she, you know, list goes on and on, to minimize that tax liability. So I don't think there's a really hard, fast answer, but the more profitable you are, the more formal you're gonna wanna be in driving a business.
The more risk you're willing to take.
And that's exactly right too.
You know, she
Yeah.
comes in and cleans and what she breaks something goes missing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely from the legal side, you know, whatever your appetite for risk is, you know, whatever your threshold is, if you're like, okay, now it's hard to explain this away as a hobby, you know, or, you know, yeah, we have people coming in all the time and, you know. Yeah. Sorry,
No,
I wish I had
That helps.
something definitive or concrete that I could say, hey, when you hit this milestone, you know, start your entity.
I do bookkeeping on the side for my stepdad, so I have one client that has 5 entities, you know, and I'm categorizing all of their transactions, but then I have this other person that has super small business, say like woodworking, and they're selling, you know, little side tables. Maybe they only make $6,000 a year, but they're like, you know, I'm making enough that I should probably start using, you know, my wood and my screws and yada yada as tax
Yeah.
deductions. So it's very like, you know,
Yeah,
it's a gray area.
very great.
The bottom line is the IRS doesn't like to find out you made money you didn't report. And that's the issue. That's what you talk about risk. Let's get by round of applause.
On that,